Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoominar from UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schaede, I'm a professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego and the director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. Welcome to San Diego. Today, of course, we're talking about tea, but before we do so, let me explain briefly where this finds you. We are at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, GPS. GPS is an international relations and public policy school. One of the offerings that we have is a master's in international affairs with a Japan specialization, but there's many more. If you would like to have some more information about us, please visit jfit.ucsd.edu. And at GPS, we have jfit, which is our Japan Center. And the website there is jfit.ucsd.edu. You go to that website, you'll find a tab called News and Media. And there you can sign up for our jfit San Diego Japan Newsflash. And right next to it is a tab called Japan Zoominars. And as you may know, our Zoominars are recorded. So you can find past recordings in this tab called Japan Zoominars. And by the way, on that matter, today you will be able to ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box. Please be assured that I will refer to you only by your first name to assure your privacy. It's Giving Tuesday, so allow me to also point out that there's a tab called Support. It would be absolutely terrific if you could consider a small donation to support our efforts. Every single penny that will be donated on this occasion will go straight into financing future Japan Zoominars. It will not go into overhead or lavish dinners or even salaries. It will go straight into organizing this event. Any and all contributions will be greatly appreciated. Thank you. So ours is a regular event. Of course, today we're going to talk about green tea, which is absolutely fun. And in 2 weeks from now, it's a little bit less fun. I'm sorry, that's a typo. It's December 10th. We'll have Stefan Haggard, and we'll talk about Japan and Korea in the Indo-Pacific. So you will get an announcement if you've signed up for this, and hopefully you can join us for that. And then we'll take a break and come back on January 10th with Michael Alfond, who used to be the head of the ACCJ in Japan and also the American Club in Tokyo. So if you could join us for that, that would be also terrific. He'll look into business opportunities in 2023. And in the meantime, of course, as I already said, you can watch past events in our JZ gallery. All right, so let me stop this and introduce our speaker. We have Professor Robert Hellyer here with us, and here he is. There you are. Hello, Robert. Welcome to San Diego. So let me introduce you briefly. So Professor Hellyer is a professor at the Department of History at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. He's earned his degrees actually on the West Coast, with a BA in Claremont McKenna and an MA and a PhD in history from Stanford University. He has visited Todai, Keio, Nichibunken, and a large number of other places to do his research. He's an expert on modern Japan and trade, and that's a fabulously interesting topic, as you will soon learn. So modern means Meiji and Taisho mostly, but of course also the late Tokugawa period, I guess. And I'll have some questions on that later. So tea and trade is our topic today. And that's because Robert has published a book titled, with that title, Green with Milk and Sugar. It was published in October 2021 with Columbia University Press and translated into Japanese earlier this year. So congratulations on that, Robert. That's a fantastic accomplishment. And so with that, the audience wants to hear about tea. So why don't we hand the microphone over to you and hear what that's all about?
Well, thank you very much, Ulrike, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you all today. So I'll turn over and share my screen here. So this book is partially a personal tea story, and it began through talks with my grandmothers, both of whom lived nearby me when I grew up in Tacoma, Washington, which is just south of Seattle. My paternal grandmother, Ethel Hellyer, was born and raised in Riverside, a suburb of Chicago. Just after graduating from college in 1931, she married my grandfather, George, and then also living in Riverside. The following year, the newly married couple sailed to Japan. Now, in this photo, my grandmother is in the first row on the far right, and my grandfather is in the back row, fifth from the right. Their destination was Shizuoka, where my grandfather would begin working in the family tea export firm, Hellyer and Company. He was familiar with Shizuoka, having lived there and in Kobe as a boy when his father had worked in the company. My grandmother reveled in life in Japan and shared many stories about her several years there. My maternal grandmother, Eleanor Ingalls, also hailed from Illinois. She was a grocer's daughter, born and raised in Galva, a town in the northwestern part of the state, which you can see on the map. Now, during my visit, she would serve me coffee and black tea, but never any of her stash of green tea, which was reserved for guests. She viewed green tea as special because growing up in Galva, it was considered the more sophisticated type of tea, as it had been viewed in the United States for the previous century. I begin with these stories as they offer personal and human insights on two links in the commodity chain of Japanese green tea at the heart of my book. One is the role of Western export firms, and second, Americans, particularly in the Midwest, who were the biggest consumers. Now, today, Americans consume primarily black teas, often hot with milk and sugar or as iced tea. In the South, my home for the past 17 years, sweet tea, black tea with lots of sugar is a regional icon and is terrific with a plate of barbecue. Now, in Japan today, two types of green tea are the most prominent. First is matcha, made from high-quality leaves and ground into a fine powder. Sencha is the most popular and well-known leaf tea. It is usually made from leaves picked in the spring and refined using a process developed during the 18th century. It is defined by its green color and light flavor. In many respects, matcha and sencha can be seen as representative of Japanese food culture today, something that the first-time visitor to Japan might try to complete the quintessential Japanese experience. Now, in addition, my book also discusses a lot about bancha, which is also classified as a green tea because of its level of oxidation. Different from sencha, is made from leaves picked later in the year and often includes stems. When brewed, bancha usually produces a brown nectar. Now, having introduced these basics about tea, I want to start out today around 1850, a time when tea consumption patterns in both the United States and Japan were surprisingly different. Around 1850, Americans, as they had for the previous 5 decades, preferred green tea. In Japan, a large percentage of people, particularly in the countryside, consumed bancha. Therefore, in 1850, we can talk about the United States as a green tea consuming nation, and Japan as a place where tea was known as a brown beverage. A legacy of the latter remains in the Japanese language today, the word chairo, literally tea color, for the color brown. How and why the two countries underwent a juxtaposition to today where Americans prefer black teas and green sencha dominates in Japan is one of the core themes of the book and something I'll outline briefly here today. So the main themes that I just want to talk about here and some of the main points of the book are talking about American tea consumption and Japanese green tea's place in it, the implications of Japan's tea export trade, and how the emerging tea industry helped create opportunities for particularly some of the former foes of the new government that took over in the Meiji Restoration of 1868. And then also talk about how the 1920s and 1930s were turning points for tea in both Japan and the United States. So to talk briefly about what was tea in early 19th century America. While Britons preferred black tea in this period, after 1800 in the United States, green tea came to hold an aura of sophistication and was more widely consumed. Green tea was sold at higher prices than black tea, and American merchants acquiring tea in Canton, then the only place in the world where Westerners could obtain tea, therefore brought more of it. And this is an ad from, you see, from a Charleston, South Carolina grocery store in 1818. In the upper right corner, I've crudely highlighted in green that there are 6 types of tea there. The first 5 are all green teas, and the last bohea is the only black tea that's available. This is quite consistent with what you would find throughout the United States in the first part of the 19th century. Now we see later in the 19th century a real increase in tea consumption in both the United States and in Britain. And I'll come back to the significance of that in just a moment. Well, at that moment is here, actually, moving on here, was the fact that how Japan, which was starting to be involved much more in trade with the West, in the treaty port regime that was created in 1859, production of tea developed in established areas such as Uji outside of Tokyo, but also new areas like Shizuoka, where new tea fields were planted and on family farms, not large plantations, an important difference in the Japanese production model at this time. Now, also, local governments offered the funds to finance this. This is not coming from the central government. And one of the areas that was the first to grow in Shizuoka was on, you can see here on the map on the left, Makinohara, which became and is still one of the more famous places in Shizuoka for tea. Now, many of the farmers in Makinohara, previously in the Edo period, that area had been left in common and was not widely cultivated. So the new farmers moving in to grow tea. And a lot of them were samurai who had fought against the Choshu-Satsuma alliance in the battles of the 1860 and then also in the Boshin War. Now, one of these men was Imai Nobuo, who had fought for the Tokugawa side since 1867 when he joined a police force in Kyoto. He was part of a militia that was involved in every major battle of the Boshin War. He was taken into custody following the Battle of Hakodate in 1869, the closing battle of that war. Yet instead of a long prison sentence, the Meiji government allowed Imai to settle in Shizuoka and take a position in the prefectural government. He later became a tea farmer and lived a quiet life until his death in 1918. Indeed, he was never disturbed, even though a magazine expose in 1900 identified him as the man who in November 1867 killed Sakamoto Ryoma, today the most famous figure of the Meiji Restoration. So many of these people have been opposing the new regime, were allowed to have new lives. And this is one of the chapters that I have in the books about how the tea industry played into helping easing socioeconomic tensions as Japan moved into the Meiji period. Now, to talk a bit about, I won't dwell on the numbers here, but you can see the growth of Japan's tea exports, but also at the bottom, just how important the American market was. That you can see how much was being shipped there, and then also the fact that 80%, up to 80% of all the commercially produced tea, much of its sencha, was exported to the United States, and tea was the #2 export in the Meiji period after silk. In the US, the Japanese tea was advertised under one broad brand name of Japan tea. And these are labels that were put on large chests that would be in grocers that you can see. It's one from New York, there's one from Cleveland, and there's one from upstate, or from coastal, I'd say, lumber country in Northern California. And I can talk more about this in the question time here, but just to note that Americans were not consuming Japanese tea in a Japanese style way. They weren't using, for example, Japanese tea sets, and they followed individual preferences, including adding milk and sugar to hot green tea. So this is a slide here. I'm also not going to dwell on this, but it just shows this was created by the Japan Tea Association in the early 1920s, and it shows how the main area of consumption even then was the Midwest. The areas shaded in green, as you can see, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, those were definitively green tea country. Now, in the 1890s, the world tea market was greatly transformed by the increase in production from South Asia. And you can see the numbers there. And British producers were able to quickly capture the British home market and looked to also expand their sales of black tea in the US. And they made some inroads in the 1890s using negative advertising campaigns. However, Japanese green tea and its exports really stabilized and were strong up through World War I, in particular because of the war and the disruptions of it, that Japanese producers were able to sell more to Europe. And as you can see, 1916 and 1917 proved banner years. There was so much tea being produced that when the early 1920s, when American taste shifted quite dramatically in the early 1920s, because of the points that I've outlined here, the negative advertising campaigns, somewhat lower prices for black teas, also rising prominence of national tea brands like the one that you see here, Chase and Sanborn. We also see this is the birth of orange pekoe, which is probably the most widely consumed type of black tea in the world today that really becomes popular in America and other parts of the world. And so we see this shift that Americans are starting to increasingly drink more black teas. So therefore, the producers in Japan face a real quandary. They have a glut. They've been producing so much tea. They've been exporting sencha to the US. Now Americans are not buying it. So what do? They turn for the first time to market sencha aggressively in the Japanese domestic market. But they face a challenge, and they do studies of tea consumption in Tokyo, and they find, quite interestingly, that many elites in Tokyo preferred bancha. They wanted something which they saw as a healthier beverage instead of sencha. So therefore, a campaign was launched to really emphasize the high level of vitamin C in green tea. And so charts like this were often added to tea advertisements. This one has at the bottom, as you can see, all kinds of fruits and vegetables, other beverages like coffee or oolong tea, but the highest in vitamin C content, according to this and every advertisement, was the sencha that you buy at the supermarket. That was what's important to have here. Also, what was emphasized was giving sencha as a gift. So these are two parts of the campaign that was mounted within Japan, and then also in parts of the empire. Manchuria was also a lot of marketing done there as well. We see here, and just to punctuate about why I emphasize the 1920s and 1930s as turning points for tea in the US and Japan, because we also see in the 1920s and 30s two new types of well-known green teas. One is genmaicha and hojicha, and I'll just talk briefly about genmaicha, which several origin stories, but one of them is that it was created in a Pyongyang hospital as a health drink because it has rice, roasted rice, and green tea with it. But these are, of course, very popular today, but their origins are very quite clearly from this period in the 20s and 30s. So sencha in Japan today, we see it still presented as a healthy beverage, and I was very surprised to find this chart here from the Tokyo Metropolitan Institute of Gerontology from 2018, which is so much like the one that I showed from the 1920s. The comparisons of different fruits or different products that we have here, cabbage, strawberries, but sencha is on top. And of course, if you're going to a department store in Japan today, you'll find sencha being labeled and widely given as a gift. So to talk about the conclusions, to finish off just this broad outline of some of the points that I've outlined, and just to think about how sencha, its story in Japan today and its place in Japan, I believe has a decidedly international story. And first is the role of the US market. Because of US demand, Japan's production boomed starting in the 1860s and 70s. So although tea had been produced in Japan for centuries, exports created a veritable tea industry with far more grown throughout the archipelago. Now, this same industry helped to ease socioeconomic tensions in the late 19th century by providing opportunities for those displaced by reforms surrounding the Meiji Restoration. People like Imai Nobuo, who was a clear enemy of the regime, but could have a new part in this Meiji Japan. And then finally, the 1920s and 1930s, we see sencha emerging as a dominant everyday tea, often presented as a health product. And this is a result of changes on the US market that created the consumption patterns that continue today. So all told, by exploring how and why Japan filled America's teacups, we gain rich and perhaps surprising insights on the international factors that have shaped what teas Japanese consume today. So thank you. That's just a outline of what I've talked about in the book. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you. It's a fascinating tour de force, sort of very deep and deeply researched book. So thank you for giving us this great overview. And I was hoping to get the book in the mail and start reading right away, but I'm now keeping it for my Christmas break. So,
Okay,
so this is a fantastic story. I have a few sort of kind of little clarification questions. Is it really true that sencha has vitamin C in it, or is this just pure marketing?
Yes, it does. I mean, I'll go back to
Really?
when I have the accounts historically.
Yeah.
I mean, there were Japanese scientists who discovered this and had some studies of it, and later there were American scientists who studied it, and they felt they disproved it. The American scientists in some of the tests they had. So I think the case today is that there is sometimes. Vitamin C is added to green tea. That's what I've seen in looking back at some of the labels, but I think there is a fair amount of it in green tea.
Oh wow! Well, let's drink more of it. Yeah. So was there some of our audience are study contemporary Japan and industrial policies and political science and that sort of thing. Was there a policy around this? I mean, do you view this? Was this an early case of where the government had anything to do with this, or was this just a the market was there and the opportunity was there and there was a lot of there was a demand and companies reacted to it, or could this be rewritten as sort of an early example of industrial policy in Japan?
I wouldn't say it's industrial policy because the Meiji government does play a role, but as I mentioned, that a lot of the early growth of production in the 1870s is because of local governments. I mean, it's really interesting to find these local officials who feel it's their duty to, sometimes you have a wealthy merchant who feels that he needs to give some money and give some land to support this growth of tea production for the good of his local area. And this is then matched a bit later in the Meiji period by the Meiji government coming in. And for example, the Meiji government sponsored a real effort to try and promote black tea production and exports. So for example, bringing in Chinese experts who did a know-how tour places around Kyushu. Unfortunately, the black tea was never really successful. They made a big push in the 1880s to sell it in Australia. But that was right at the time when a lot cheaper black tea was coming in from South Asia, from India and Ceylon. So those are the combination of the local initiatives with the Meiji government evolved with that.
Interesting. So the questions are coming in, and the first one is from Alberto, and it's about this turning point in your story where suddenly the US demand for green tea shifts into a preference to drink black tea.
Right.
And you mentioned negative advertising, and so he wonders whether you can please provide a little bit more context or examples of this negative advertising of green tea, that what happened in the US there.
Sure. That was one thing just for time I didn't include, but it was essentially what the negative advertising focused on was painting green tea, both from Japan and China, as dirty, dangerous, and fraudulent. And the negative advertising was very focused on using racism, particularly the idea that there were dirty coolies in East Asia, in China or Japan, who were producing this tea. And many times in advertisements, we would talk about how the sweat from this hot, dirty coulis would be adding to the peculiar flavor, as it described, of Japanese or Chinese green tea. Also, some advertisements talked about how Americans should be assured that Indian or Ceylon tea was produced under white supervision and not under coolie supervision. So these are a very sustained effort through the 1890s. What I outlined there, that I don't see it initially leading then a direct line from the 1890s into the 1920s, because we also have that real growth of exports for Japan during World War I. So I see this negative advertising in combination, as outlined, with lower prices and with the growth of national brands. But even, reading the tea journals in the 1920s, the merchants are really quite surprised about how quickly Americans seem to turn to black teas in this period. And so it's, in studying cultural history and studying things about foods and beverages, it's really intriguing to see how things change like that. And it's very hard to find the one answer with that. So that's why I came down to those combination of factors.
I mean, it's fad and fashion. I mean, even as we were talking about the milk and sugar, I was thinking that Starbucks has kind of brought that back, right? Because there's milk and sugar and everything there, and you can have a green tea latte or something. So, what is that? But yeah, so these things come and go, I guess, is part of it. But clearly, right, then also the signs of the time, right? So when did this negative advertising start? Are we talking the 30s, or are we moving into pre-World War II sentiments, or?
Well, the campaign, the idea is actually, I've not researched this, but historians of the British Empire talk about seeing it developing actually in Britain in the 1860s and 70s as the way that's combined with the growth of production in South Asia, where the same campaigns of describing the fraudulent, dirty green tea. It's also that same campaign applied in Australia quite effectively as a way of turning people against Chinese tea or Japanese tea.
So that's actually the next question that Jill has raised, and that was actually on my mind as well. So some of the flyers you show were actually about Chinese tea, right? So did people at the time make a clear difference between tea from China and Japan, or was that seen as similar, or what is there a mix up between the two, or how did that work? Did Americans understand the difference between a Chinese tea and a Japanese tea?
Well, I think they did. Well, I mean, we're talking about the period because we have up until 1860, the only tea in America is Chinese tea. Right. And so there were those varieties that I outlined, the ones like gunpowder and the like. So those varieties still continued, but Japan tea was the first national brand on the US market, in the sense that it was connected to the nation of its origin. There was no China tea up to that period. It was all gunpowder or these other types of teas. And so that continued on, and Japan tea had its own niche for many people. And the labels that I showed, those were, as I said, on the larger tea chests, and they had basket fired or pan fired. And this was how the tea was processed in these factories, say in Yokohama or Nagasaki or Kobe, how it was done. Either the moisture was removed either in a pan or in a basket, the pan being heated underneath the basket as well. And so Americans would choose their Japanese green tea based on that. And then also Americans were very, very keen to have their tea be as green as possible at the market. So much of Chinese tea and Japanese green tea was colored with Prussian blue. And Americans were well aware of this. And this is one of the points that I make in the book, about how by the 1880s that green tea had really become democratized because of these colored varieties that even people of low means could purchase for only about 10 cents a pound. And this is quite a change for when, say, in 1860, when tea had been close to $1 a pound. So this is there's quite a lot of variety of teas, and Americans are in many ways very discerning in what they're choosing.
So you mentioned the Midwest and your family from Chicago, and of course Chicago was a big trading place at the time. But Ian wonders, how long did it take to ship from Japan, China, across the continent, and then why the Midwest? What happened there? What's the story at the U.S. end of this?
Oh, sure. Well, I guess to answer how it gets there, I mean, most of it's coming through New York and then put on rails to Chicago. Some is also coming to San Francisco or ports on the West Coast and put on rails and sent to Chicago. And because of the networks, it could be pretty fast. I think if you have the first pickings in May, they could get to market in the U.S., say, by early August, I think is what they would think about that. Why the Midwest is green tea country? This too, I guess my conclusion after looking at this for a long time, I mentioned how green tea has the aura of sophistication in the early 19th and continuing in the late 19th century. In the East Coast, starting from the 1850s, is more of a fad for oolong tea, a lot of it produced in Taiwan. And so green tea sort of loses some of its allure on the East Coast, but it's still the old style sophistication. And I think this is why it's adopted in the Midwest, because we have the Midwest in the late 19th century. It's such a growing region, so much economic growth and so many people coming in. So I think it would make sense that an area would then, as to enhance its prestige, if you will, or people there saying, well, we're still holding on to the old legacy of American tea ways by consuming green tea.
Mm. So we have lots of questions coming in on both sides of this. So at the same time that you were talking about Chicago, and I guess this green tea was sophisticated. You mentioned that your grandmother, later on would not let you drink green tea because that was for the higher guests or something. Is that
Yes.
Is that right? Right. So okay. So how about in Japan? So we have a question on the bancha. And by the way, thank you for finally explaining to me why chairo is the word for brown in Japan. I've always wondered why that is not green, but okay, so chairo is actually brown because of bancha. So the question is maybe reflecting from today's thinking whether bancha was like the common folk drink and sencha and matcha more elite and higher price even in Japan then, or what happened in Japan? So was there a socioeconomic status associated with drinking different types of tea like it might be, later on?
No, I didn't find a connection socioeconomically, say that elites will only drink sencha and lower class people of lower economic means will only drink bancha. Just to briefly say what I found, say in the late Edo period, Edo tea sellers are selling bancha. They're selling a lot of different types of sencha. They've got mugicha there too as well that they're selling. So it's quite a variety. A lot of bancha is being produced in areas around Osaka and sold on the Osaka market. So there's quite a variety of teas that are available. But for most of the people that are living in the countryside, they're living on very slim means. And so a lot of people were growing tea in between their rice paddies, for example, that they'd have a few tea plants. And so they'd be picking the teas as they needed it and storing it in their own ways. And this is one of the ways to define bancha is that it is picked throughout the year and then refined and stored in local ways. There's not a one way of doing it of refining it as there with sencha, for example. So we have more bancha being consumed in the countryside. But what was so interesting to me, one of the many intriguing finds in this was this study that was done by the Japan Tea Association in 1925 when they realized that they had to sell more in the domestic market, but they really didn't understand the domestic market. And so they were looking into Tokyo, for example, and that they found that elites were really focused on buying bancha, that they saw it as healthier, much like, I never wanted to eat brown bread growing up. I wanted to eat the good white bread. My mom said, eat the healthier stuff, right? Those kinds of things. And so bancha really had much more of a niche in Japan. So when you have this glut of sencha and you want to sell it, you've got to do the hard sell and you've got to change some minds. And that was done over the course, starting in the 20s and 30s.
So there's we have several questions around whether there's a parallel story about coffee, and I'm asking this with a little bit of apprehension because your book is about tea, and we want to talk about tea. But the question really is whether this is how special is this story, right? So if you look at vending machines in Tokyo today, Glenn asks, you see 3 waters, 4 teas, and 2 rows of coffee, right? And so how does the coffee come in, and is there sort of a parallel story there, or is it a completely different kind of thing?
Sure. I mean, I didn't look a lot of coffee. I mean, Corky White's book is his fantastic coverage about coffee in Japan. And one of the things that is intriguing to me about how tea plays out both in Japan and in other parts of the world is that it never is the outside the home, to say here, the social beverage that coffee is. I mean, coffee has a real growth starting particularly in the Meiji period when more imports come in from Brazil, more cafes are opening up in major cities, diversifying into, say, the jazz cafes and things like that. We don't have a jazz tea place, right? So that to me is the main difference I was looking into. I was not trying to get into too much about coffee consumption, but I was trying to outline how tea was consumed. And if I could say the conclusion that I made about how we can think about Japanese tea consumption from the late Edo period into today is consumed inside and outside the home all the time. And it's not gendered either. And this is something that you start to have developing in the United States in the late 19th century, where hot tea is considered gendered, but iced tea is not. And that's still, I think, some of the ways that might be today. So that's kind of long-winded, but I guess I don't know as much about coffee.
So we actually had a Zoominar with Mary White, who is a coffee specialist, and she there was a part of the conversation about how the coffee shop actually became this social thing that you just mentioned, especially then in the Taisho years when the protests and Hibiya Koen and all of those wonderful things, that the coffee shop, and it was this foreign thing, and so because it was foreign, it wasn't gendered, and it had jazz with it and so forth and so on. So it's a slightly different story from this one. So I want to come back a little bit to the larger, to the period that we're in here, which is super interesting. You mentioned silk as the main export item of Japan in the Meiji years, and so, or even the late Tokugawa years. So your story starts in the 1850s, right? So what was the larger trade situation? Maybe even your family's business of shipping stuff from Japan to the United States. Can you couch this tea story in the larger thing of how trade developed for Japan at the time, for those of us who are not historians necessarily? So how did tea become so? Was it like a rocket thing, or was the entire trade growing very fast?
No, well, thanks for the question, and I will answer it, yes, with my own family history, because I was able to access the letters of my uncle 5 generations back. His name was William Alt. He came to Nagasaki in 1860 from Britain via Shanghai, and he started a company there that was an import-export firm. And he and the other merchants in Nagasaki at the time in the 1860s were making most of their money on ships and guns, because this was the time of so much political and machinations back and forth between the domains and the Tokugawa shogunate, in between the domains themselves as well. So that was where the money was made. William Alt then started to transition into selling more tea. He was doing tea from the start, but he made more money initially in these ships and guns. But tea then, for his company, continued on, and then he made a fortune at the age of 32, bought a house outside of London and a villa on the Italian coast, and retired wonderfully, and then left it to his nephew, my great-great-grandfather, who continued the company, and they were exclusively focused on tea. So that was one way of which we can think about how Japan's foreign trade developed from the late, the Bakumatsu period, and then into the Meiji period.
Great. So we have a question from Michael that goes into the 20th century, but we can make the connection, I guess. And I'll just read it because it's a little bit long, so it's easier for me. So Michael writes, you mentioned the shift of green tea advertising to the Japanese market by the 1930s because the demand in the US is down, and so let's advertise it in Japan. Given the politics of the time, so we're in the 1930s now, was there any attempt to pitch drinking green tea as a patriotic duty for good Japanese? Right? Relatedly, you also mentioned selling tea in the Japanese Empire. And how important a market was the empire to Japan tea growers?
Well, thank you. There was a patriotic effort. There were some points about how, because there was a lot of tea available, and campaigns to send it to soldiers at the front was one way of thinking about, and this would be a healthy beverage that they would need. And actually, there's an amazing campaign as well that housewife associations were mobilized throughout Japan during the war to go and collect used tea leaves because they were collected and then put in bags and sent as horse fodder to the front, because this is the idea there was still a amount of vitamin C and other vitamins in them. So why don't waste them, feed them to horses, and this will help the war effort. So there was that patriotic duty, and there was a pretty intensive push to try and sell more tea in Manchuria. And it was a lot of the health angle as well, saying that, for example, that the belief that people in Manchuria didn't have many vegetables in the cold winter, so they could drink Japanese green tea and get some vitamin C and other nutrients from this. It was somewhat successful, but even as the American market was dropping into the late 1930s, it was still far bigger than the Manchurian or the imperial market. So it was the Japanese tea exports was forever tied from its start to its end, and it really, of course, ended with the start of the war in 1941. Was tied to the U.S.
So that's super interesting. Yeah. So the patriotic duty, drink tea. That's a new one. You mentioned the gendered aspects of tea, and we have two questions on that. One is, and I'm not sure this is true, but the question is whether it is the case still that the masters of tea ceremony usually have like sort of male teachers. And was that both for men and women to drink in Japan and in the US in the old days, or and both? So actually two questions, I guess. And Joan wonders whether the scientific aspects, and this is sort of a gender thing because women, you had women there and they care about the family and the vitamin C and the, sort of, so was this health aspect also sort of sold in the US, or is this a Japanese aspect to it?
Oh, well, thanks for the questions. First, the tea ceremony, I didn't look at it in much detail. I wanted it to be, there's so much great research on the tea ceremony, and I was thinking the question of Rebecca Corbett's really great book about women that were involved in the tea ceremony in the Edo period and the important role they played. So I would refer to her work on that one. As far as the scientific aspect, yes, it was a real push by the Japan Tea Association in the 1920s, starting because they were seeing themselves losing this market share of the black tea, and they had landed upon this idea of health product vitamin C and were promoting it in Japan. So they actually hired J. Walter Thompson, a big advertising firm, to do a big campaign, and they pushed to have this sense of vitamin C and health product. J. Walter Thompson executives apparently were advised them not to take this course and say that it probably wouldn't work in the American market, and that proved the case. It was also a problem because the Food and Drug Administration, which was just starting to grow at that time, studies were done, and these studies could not replicate the same amount of vitamin C in Japanese green tea. This is something I mentioned a moment ago. So this campaign was tried, the health campaign, it just fell flat. And so the Japan Tea Association shifted to a campaign of a drink for relaxation. And there's some wonderful advertisements talking about how the executive should have a cup of tea late in the afternoon, or the housewife should have a cup of tea late in the afternoon, trying to hit all sectors of society to say that how it'll energize you but relax you late in the day. So that's where they continued the campaign into the 30s.
So this health aspect is very interesting, right? There's this. I mean, I think we see this today still, right? There's this. Everything has to be somewhat healthy, or if it's not healthy, then it's not done, right? In Japan, whereas Americans care much less about that most of the time, I guess. So that's super interesting. The American sense of Japan at the time was what? I mean, I understand what it was in the 20th century, but in the late 19th century, did Americans have a clear sense of what Japan was? I mean, you mentioned earlier that maybe there was some confusion between China and Japan, which is so far away, coolies and all that thing. But what was actually sort of from reading maybe the diaries of your family members and so forth, what was their assessment of Japan as a nation during the Meiji years?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say through the lens of tea, of thinking about many Americans weren't associating the larger, say, image of Japan as a growing economy or a military power that you might see in the Meiji period through tea. And just in the way that I was so surprised I never really found any boycotts of tea. That Americans would be saying, well, we're worried about Japan and its role, aggression against China, for example, let's boycott tea. Didn't happen in that way. So I guess that's one way to answer the question. I didn't find, for example, in the letters of my uncle 5 generations back, it's so frustrating. These letters are actually that he wrote to his mother. And he never mentions anybody that he meets. He never mentions a Japanese person. He's meeting Tokugawa officials or others, and as a historian saying, why don't you just describe who you met? But of course, I guess it wouldn't have meant anything to his mother, so he didn't include it. So in that case, my family's records are sadly lacking in giving us more of a broader picture and insights in those ways.
So from the U.S. perspective, how big an import item was tea? It was probably a small item, right? It was nothing that people would be particularly aware of, I guess.
Yeah, overall, right? It's a small part of the import trade at the time. Although it is really surprising going back in the 19th century during the Civil War, for example, the Union government was slapping taxes and increasing taxes on import taxes on tea, and that was a big tea and coffee. A big means of revenue, and those only came off in 1872, which really also helped to increase the import trade. But they were put back on, some tariffs were back on right at the time of the Spanish-American War, which was a real challenging situation for the Japanese producers. They were lifted a couple years later, but tea. The taxes on tea and coffee were actually a fairly significant revenue stream. I don't know how that fits in with other tariffs. I haven't looked at that on tariffs and other goods, but
yeah. So I think there was a general fascination with Asia in the West in those days, right? So I remember my grandmother in Germany had a mahjong set, and sort of, where did that come from? And so there was a fascination with things Asian. And I think that was also true in the United States. And we see it in many areas, not just food, right? Frank Lloyd Wright was fascinated the Japanese architecture, and of course went all the way over to build the Teikoku Hotel. And so I think there was a lot more going on between the U.S. and Japan than meets the eye. Also on the cultural dimensions, whether that's tea or art or architecture. So you wrote a book about tea, and now you're done with the tea. What comes next after such a fantastic topic? That sounds like a great challenge to find a new research topic.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, it is a challenge. It's also a fun challenge to think about. I am hoping to go on leave next year and start researching about the history of bread in modern Japan, starting again from roughly the 1850s. And what intrigues me is about today, Kyoto is the highest bread consuming area in Japan today. Okinawa, we might call the most westernized part of Japan, is very low in bread consumption. Hokkaido,
but they have the thickest slices, right?
Yeah, that's true. And Hokkaido, where we have the wheat and flour produced, is also quite low in these figures. So I think there's a really interesting story to tell there. I love Japanese bread as well. So I'm looking into it. That's what I plan to look into, but it's still a very new topic for me. So I can only have some questions and some interesting leads that I want to start following.
So that would be very interesting, right? Because now you would go down the road of what's the wheat trade like?
Yes.
Right? And how did American wheat end up in Japan, and when did it first arrive? Actually, it's an interesting question. So the original trade, so the period that we're talking about here, the 1870s, sort of stuff starts coming in. But of course, before that, a lot of the trade that Japan did was with the Netherlands, so with continental Europe, I guess. Was there anything in this area like bread, tea, other food items that actually came through the trade with the Dutch, or was that more on horses and metals and cloth, I guess, or whatever that was?
Oh, you mean you're talking about in the late Edo period?
Yeah, late Edo. Yeah, I guess it must have continued, right? Did it come to a full stop, the trade with the Dutch after the Meiji Restoration?
It pretty much transitioned. I think I know a little bit about the Dutch trade at the end of the Edo period. I mean, it's still a lot of copper that's being exported, and as you mentioned, some specialty goods like clocks and the like that are being imported. I'm not sure how that transitions in the early Meiji period, but up until that point, I mean, yes, there was the trade with Western Europe, but China was still really the main market. It was being exported, and a lot of marine products, kelp, abalone, shark fins were being exported from Japan to China, and Japan was actually importing a fair amount of silver in return, and that was the regime that was changed by the opening of the ports in 1859, and so Japanese traders start to shift from those and to focus on China to selling to Western markets.
Well, that's interesting, because I would have thought that there would have been some tea trade also with the Dutch, but that doesn't seem to figure in here. So the green tea never travel to Europe then, is that right?
Japanese green tea?
Yeah.
No, not so much. There's some samples that Siebold brought back in Leiden. Yes, and there were attempts to actually, I think Siebold was involved in a scheme to get some plants, Japanese tea and plants, and grow them in Java. That wasn't successful. That was in the 1820s. So yes, that's another really interesting things about how this tea trade plays out. That really from the start, it's focus on the U.S. Canada is also a big market, but it's not going to Europe.
So Jill wonders, actually, did Americans drink tea in fine china cups in those days? And was this green tea actually kind of, done in china teacups?
Well, I come down to what is American tea practice. It's really individual, right? Of what you want to drink it in. That there was not sort of set ways about. I use the example of chai today in India. If you're ordering chai, it's gonna have milk in it, right? this is something that you think about. And in America, it was whatever you want to put into it, how you want to drink it, whatever cup, things like that.
It's America.
Yeah, there wasn't a sense of that I could find that you wanted to acquire particular tea wares to consume your tea in. I mean, there was a fad of creating tea rooms, Japanese tea rooms, or tea gardens, right? That you have, for example, at the Huntington in Pasadena, right? Things like that. So there is that, as you mentioned earlier, that fascination with things Japanese. But it doesn't always connect to tea. That's a surprising thing I found. I thought there'd be more connection, but I really didn't find it.
Yeah. So they didn't, the tea ceremony didn't travel. It was just the tea that traveled, I guess. Is that fair to say?
Yes. I mean, the tea ceremony was used as a vehicle to try and promote more tea at the World Fairs. You had, for example, in Chicago in 1893, or in Philadelphia, 1876, things like that. You would have a tea display. And so that was one of the ways, but really it was, and those are particularly in Chicago in 1893, it was trying to get more Americans to drink some higher grade teas and actually maybe even try some matcha. But that was never successful.
But it also was used to create the stereotype, right, of the geisha and the tatami mat, and I understand in that expo they had a lot of these like little Japanese houses and tea places and so forth to create that image.
Oh yes, they did have a tea room, and you could pay, different prices to go have different quality cups of teas and have more of a production of how it was served to you as well.
So we're nearing the end of our hour, but we have 3 comments that I want to share with you on your next project, which is bread.
Okay.
Robert points out that there's a Japanese bakery in Paris, and that is excellent and makes maybe better croissants than the French would know how to make. And Ian tells us that luxury table bread is a big trend in Japan right now. So luxury table bread. I don't know what that means exactly, but luxury bread. So these things are fascinating, right? So how is tea in the United States? It's, iced tea, or you drink it like you want it. In Japan, it's like this luxury thing, and these things turn as they travel the ocean. So we look forward to what you'll find on the bread and what the turns there were, and why it is that, according to some, the Japanese know how to make better breads, and some people that have been doing it for much longer times, like the Germans or the Swiss or those types of people. Right? So the Japanese bread is like amazingly good, and so I hope you can tell us. Right?
One of the things I want to figure out.
Tell us why that is. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Robert Hellyer, to have joined us today. It was a fascinating story about tea. And folks, we'll be back in 2 weeks with Stefan Haggett, who is going to compare how Japan and Korea view the security situation in Northeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. So I hope you can join us for that. In the meantime, stay safe, and thank you all for your excellent questions and joining us today. And Robert, thank you. That was a ton of fun. That was great. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.